Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and I'm joined by Lisa. It is June, so it is officially summer. How does that make you feel, Lisa?
Thrilled, obviously. As people who our listeners know well that we are deeply impacted by the seasons and the weather.
I was going to say, I guess it's not technically summer yet. Isn't June 21st the start of summer?
Yeah, but after Memorial Day is the start of summer. We all know that.
That's how. I know, though, you have written in the past about how June is kind of also a griefy month for you.
It's true. June is a really griefy month for me. And I feel like I always feel mixed about June because it does have all of these deep grief associations for me. Just because my dad died in June, Father's Day is in June. My dad died like right around Father's Day. So I just always associate June with that. But I love the summer, and it's weird. I actually have a lot of really, even going back as far as when my dad died, I have a lot of like really positive summer associations, even with that time. Like I remember feeling grateful that it was summer and thinking to myself, like, if this was the depths of February, that I don't know how I would be coping. One of the things that I really felt like I did and utilized in getting through just that early, complete sort of crisis shock place of early grief was I would take these like really long drives on beautiful days and really long hikes. And I would go like I would drive way out into the country somewhere and then go on these really long hikes alone. And I remember thinking like, thank God the weather is really nice right now, because if that was not the case, I don't know what I would be doing with myself. So it's funny. I like have this both associations with the month of June and just the summer. I know it's when I'm usually at my best, even in Baltimore when it is 98 degrees and 90% humidity. That is still my happy season.
Yeah. I like that perspective. I mean, and, you know, I think a lot of people, they might relate to that, or they might be like, oh, it ruined my happy season. You know, I think that just depends. But I do definitely see how being able to just be out in nature and maybe in the sunshine, taking those long drives, listening to music could be such a relief from what you were going through. So it's always good when you can find those coping tools, and the ones that like feel immediately useful to you in those early days aren't always going to be the ones that always are your go-to later on down the road. But
yeah, once it's February and you can't do it anymore.
Well, right. That's what I'm thinking about. Like, oh, you're right. Like in my mom died in October, and it was really tough because it was like heading into winter and the holiday season. And so I'm like, yeah, that was kind of restricting in a way. But on the other hand, I am somebody who likes to kind of be home and warm and comfortable. So on the other hand, I'm like, oh, maybe I don't even know. I have to think about it. Like maybe that for me was helpful.
Yeah. I mean, I do think the seasons change we've talked about this before, going into winter, sometimes it feels more reflective. And I do know, when my sister's partner died, it was winter. I remember it was so cold and it was so miserable. And I do remember at that time feeling like that awareness that the external world felt a little more reflective of just where my whole family was than in the summer when it was, I would go places and it just felt more like I was staring at all of these other people having lovely fun times and who seemed really carefree. And in February, that doesn't always feel the case when you look around, even when there's people out and about. It's just there's sort of a different feeling to it. So yeah, I don't know. I am really constantly, I think, aware of how my environment is reflecting or not reflecting my interior experience, which sounds really egocentric, but
I agree with that. I am too. I mean, we talk about the weather constantly on this podcast, and it's because I think we are very impacted by it. And we live somewhere where there are 4 seasons. And I do think what you said is interesting. Like the winter time is more a time for reflection, and maybe just, there's a season for everything. Like maybe we need all that. We need that winter time to kind of hole up and reflect and have that time that feels a little more gray and calm and tired. And we need that time that's a little hopefully more energetic, and when we're able to get out, and if we're not connecting with other people, at least connect with the world in a different way.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the reasons that nature has always been such a huge coping strategy for me, or place that I feel connected, part of it is that I do really appreciate like the cycles of nature and of everything, and of this constant reminder in the world around us that we're always going through these seasons of death and rebirth and change, and that you can look to the world around you and sort of see that in this way that can feel both hopeful and optimistic, but also, just reflective of how bleak things can feel. And I don't know, those connections in nature have always been really helpful for me. So
I do think that reminder, because I really don't like the winter. I highly dislike it, especially from like mid-January on. And just that reminder that like this will end and the sun will come out. Like it does feel like a lesson for life and many of the things that we go through. So anyways, what we wanted to talk about today is the grief of getting sober. And as we were talking about a little bit before the podcast, this is something that I think, we're specifically talking about sobriety, but really it can apply to so many different lifestyle changes that we make because they are something that we think is positive or healthy for us. And so it might not be a perfect kind of parallel, but a lot of what we were going to talk about today, I think, does parallel a lot of different types of lifestyle changes that we go through. Because a lot of times we do things in our lives because we think that they are what we need to do. We think they are what will be healthy for us. We think hopefully it will be a positive change. But of course, along with that comes a lot of loss because it's change. And so we wanted to take a little time to talk about that experience.
I'm really glad we're talking about this because I think we've talked about it between ourselves a lot for a long time. And we had talked for a long time about recording a podcast or having an article or, talking about this a little more, and haven't until recently. And you finally wrote an article about it not long ago. And I was really glad to have on our site because I think this is something that comes up so often, not just independently for people who have decided to get sober completely independent of a bereavement related loss, but that it's also something we hear with folks who have had someone die and for one reason or another either have really gone down a path where that substance has become a problem and then they've had to make the decision to get sober, or it didn't become a problem, but they saw the potential that it could become a problem. This has come up a lot recently from some folks on Instagram when we've posted about substances and grief, of saying, it was never a problem for me, but I saw the writing on the wall. Like I knew if I let myself keep drinking or keep using whatever substance I used, that it could become a problem. So I just decided I'm going to get sober. And so I just think this affects a lot of people. And a lot of times the loss piece of it isn't acknowledged. There's often this like, good for you, you got sober, especially for folks where it was a really significant problem. But I think, to some degree, people think, oh yeah, you're being healthy, you're taking care of your body, you're not, using substances. This should be all a good change. And what we of course hear from people is, yes, and there's this huge pile of grief that goes with it.
Yeah. So you referenced the article that I wrote, and I'll just kind of put it out there. It sort of came about because I stopped drinking in, 2018. When I found out I was pregnant with my most recent child, which was a bit of a surprise. And she came to us 10 years after the older sibling. So it wasn't really something I was expecting. But I stopped drinking then, of course, because I was pregnant. But at that time, there had just been a lot going on in my life. And I knew that I was using alcohol as a coping tool. I had been drinking since high school. I started drinking like a lot of high schoolers do. And I think for me, it was something that was like social and fun. But for me, because I'm more of an introvert, I also think that it was something that became a bit of a crutch and a coping tool for me, because when I was drinking, a lot of that social anxiety and things like that quieted down. And so I would have more fun, and I would think in my head, I was more likable. Who knows if that was true, you know? But then I would also wake up in the morning and be like, oh God, what did I say? What did I do? So it was like inviting other social anxiety. But in the moment, you know, you just want to have fun with everybody. But also another thing I knew about myself is I was definitely one of those people that I didn't need to drink every day necessarily, but once I did, I was not good at stopping. Like once I had that first 1 or 2 drinks, I was going to keep going. And so it led to me going overboard a lot more often than I would have liked. And as a kid, teenager, you know, you always think you're going to go through high school and college and you're going to get to adulthood and you're going to chill out. You're going to stop drinking as much. You're going to have kids. You're going to be this responsible adult. And my parents, they really did not drink. My mother never had a sip of alcohol her whole life. My dad might have like a beer or two at a barbecue. I never saw my parents drunk or intoxicated in any way. So I just assumed that was kind of how things were. But then I got to adulthood and I was like, oh, that is not at all how things are. Like, in my adulthood, I feel like people were drinking more often and more of it than really when I was younger. And so I kind of just went along with that pattern as well. And I kept drinking. And I just knew that if I didn't stop because of the pregnancy, I would never have another good reason to stop again. Like if I started after having Agnes, I just had a feeling I would never have another good reason to have that hard stop. So I did fully stop, but a lot of my life had really centered around, you know, socially at least, around drinking with people, like drinking buddies in a sense. And so anyways, that's how like my story goes. And everybody's story is so incredibly unique and different. And everyone has like different layers to this story. And so that decision to get sober, I think is different for every person. It's incredibly personal. And sometimes, you know, we think about it like we think about on television. You see like intervention and you see people hitting rock bottom and like you think that's what it looks like. But a lot of times I think it looks like people saying to themselves like, this is getting in the way of me being the parent I want to be, living the life I want to live, having, you know, kind of the purpose and meaning that I want to have. It's making me feel sick every morning. It's making me feel hazy every single night. And I don't personally like that. For me, that is a problem. So it's really subjective for each individual person. And as you mentioned, Lisa, a lot of people have shared with us after experiencing loss, for them, they said, oh, I need to make this individual decision now, because I can see how I'm starting to use this as a coping tool, or I can see how I could get to a place where this is my go-to coping. And that's not really what I want to do.
Yeah, I think the idea that there are so many people out there who decide to stop using alcohol or other substances, not because of a rock bottom moment. Like, I think that piece is so important and under discussed. I think because, like you said, shows like Intervention or knowing people who have had rock bottom moments and really extreme versions of addiction, that oftentimes that's what we assume the trajectory looks like for people, when so often more and more that's not what it looks like. There's more and more, even now when you look at the data that's out there about generationally, you know, younger people are drinking less and less. There's far more Gen Zers who don't drink at all than millennials. And then there's more millennials who have stopped drinking than Gen Xers. Like, it's something that has changed, I think, in the culture, where people are asking themselves the question more of like, how is this working for me? And maybe it's not that I'm not able to, you know, go to work, or my relationships are really decimated because of this substance, but I'm still making a big change, it's still a huge change in social ways, in identity ways, in coping ways, you know, in all, it still affects life in all of these different ways. And I think sometimes people feel like they don't necessarily fit if they weren't in that extreme place of addiction, but they were in that place of like, I just realized it wasn't working for me anymore, of being able to acknowledge all the losses that come with it.
Totally. And you know, it's like I said, it's different for every person. Like the layers are different. For somebody who maybe never really drank that much, maybe started to drink a little bit, then decided to quit, there's like one layer there, you know?
Yep.
But for somebody who's been drinking their entire lives, maybe was drinking every day, there are a lot more layers going on there. It has become a part of their day-to-day life. It's become a part of their relationships. And so it's just totally depends on the person. So I guess what we really want to talk about today is just like acknowledging that though it is a healthy change, it's one that does cause, like you said, a lot of loss for people, whether it's, you know, somebody who feels like, well, it caused a little and it was easy to cope with, or somebody who's like, this has turned my life on its head. I think, you know, we often think, we've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast, that when something's positive, you know, loss somehow takes a back seat. But what we know is that change equals loss, even if it's positive. And it might be that the loss is little, like I said, and easy to cope with. It might be that the positive things you're getting kind of mitigates the struggles you're having. Or what we hear a lot is that it might be that you were expecting it to be like mostly positive and you are really caught off guard by actually how hard the change is and by how much loss you're experiencing. And that's often where we meet people because they're like, whoa, I really didn't expect this to cause me to experience struggles like this. I thought it would be kind of like, oh, good, smooth sailing. And then it's actually like so much more difficult to detangle than they thought.
Yeah. I mean, obviously your story is, you know, unique to you and going to be different than other people listening. But I'm curious for you when you think about the losses that have felt most present, that have impacted you alongside of your decision to get sober? Like, are there some that really stand out as the big ones for you?
I mean, there are certainly a couple, but I think the number one thing, especially if you were somebody who, whether we're talking about a substance, alcohol, a drug, or maybe it's a lifestyle change that, you know, you were a part of a certain group, had a certain affiliation, and you've changed. I think one of the biggest ones for people is just the relationships. A lot of the time, the people that you were kind of engaging in certain activities with, whatever it is, when you stop, sometimes you learn a little bit about what was really behind those relationships. And I think a lot of times things become a little more clear about them. I definitely think there were quite a few people that I was spending a lot of time around that when you took the substance away, there wasn't that much in common anymore. Right. I also think that I was less appealing to them at that point. When people are drinking, oftentimes they want everybody to be drinking. I have groups of people in my life now who could care less whether I'm drinking. You know, they never offer a drink. They don't care. They just want to do their thing, you know, and that's good and fine. But then I have other groups of people that they are the people who constantly want to be like, have a drink, have a shot, you know, let's go do this, let's go do that. And I think that you really have to learn who you can be around without feeling that pressure, the people who kind of will respect your boundary and not try and tempt you out of your boundary. And so I think that there's a lot of new things you have to navigate with people. And I do unfortunately think you lose some people who you either realize, you know, maybe the relationship was based around that lifestyle, or you realize, sadly, they're not really safe to be around anymore. And I think on the other side too, like people who are still continuing to like, who are still in that lifestyle, you know, it's sad for them to lose the person who has to go.
Absolutely.
But it just kind of is one of those things where it's like, it's sad for both of us, but it's what I need in my life.
Yeah. And I think that that acknowledgement that it doesn't even if you realize, wow, the relationship really was based heavily around the substance, or this person isn't able to be supportive of me in my sobriety, I think other people outwardly might then be like, oh, well then like that's no big loss. Like you've, you know, you've realized that relationship somehow wasn't a real relationship, but that's not the case, right? Like we can have relationships even when they were based around substances that were really meaningful relationships when the substance was involved. Yeah. And there are so many reasons that really wonderful, amazing people and friends aren't able to support your sobriety because it brings up stuff in them or because of whatever else is going on. So there's still a huge sense of loss that goes with that I think sometimes is underestimated by other people. I know, you know, we've heard it, I think, from so many different people who, you know, once they're sober or in recovery or however they kind of are thinking of it, where they're just like, everybody thinks like, oh, I should just say kind of like good riddance to those other friends. They were holding me back, rather than seeing them as meaningful, complex relationships, even if they're not relationships that fit anymore.
Yeah, it's so easy when you're outside of it to like make things seem two-dimensional, but relationships are complex. You know, it's not just this caricature of somebody who uses drugs or drinks with you. You know, it's like somebody who is a person who is many times, you know, a perfectly reasonable, lovely person. It's just the fact that you don't engage in the same activities anymore. Your lives are taking two different paths, but there's still people that you shared a lot with. Like there's a lot that happens in between taking a drink and taking another drink. Like there's a lot that happens between you, and it's not black or white, good or bad at all. And so it's just the fact that you're deciding to make a change, and that for whatever reason, it's taking you in a different direction. And it may even be that somebody's saying to themselves, I just don't think that person's safe to be around right now because I'm feeling vulnerable. I'm not feeling strong enough yet. And it may just be that they have to take a pause, but like they miss that person in that pause, and they hope that that person doesn't feel hurt by them taking the pause or doesn't lose faith in them or, you know, write them off in that pause. Along with that, I think it interestingly intersects with another loss, and that's just kind of like how you see yourself and your identity. Because I think in many ways you have your own kind of private identities, but then you have your identities that relate to how you think the world sees you and how you relate to other people. And I do think, you know, when you make a change, the question is like, how do other people perceive me now? And when it came to drinking specifically, you know, it's like, well, am I boring to be around? You know, do people still want to invite me places? And it's been hard for me to figure that out because I got sober and had a baby at the exact same time, at a time when no one else in my circle had young children, because I had her later in life. So I'm like, is it the baby or the sobriety? What is it? Because like I definitely was not being included in the same ways. And I think this is something a lot of people go through when they have any change. We hear this in grief a lot of times where people are, you know, going through changes in identity because of their grief, and they're kind of now being left out, and they're wondering like, what is it? You know, is it because I'm like, people don't want to be around me? Like, what's going on? So you definitely do kind of question, who am I now? A little bit, especially like if the lifestyle change is one that you've had for a long time. Like if you had a certain lifestyle for a really long time and it became kind of a part of, what you do and who you are and how you relate to other people, then when it's changed and it's different, you may hop into another kind of identity real quick. But there's a lot of people who don't. There's a lot of people who kind of search and they say like, oh, well, shoot, like, who am I now?
So much rebuilding, I think, that has to happen. And I think with alcohol specifically, one of the things that you're pointing out a little bit too is that if social anxiety has been a piece of, you know, what need a substance is meeting, it's really hard. And it's not just alcohol that does that. Like for plenty of other substances, that is the case. But I think it does suddenly then bring up all of these questions about sort of what is my social identity when I take away this substance, and how do I navigate that both within the relationships, but also just with my own comfort in myself and coping with my social anxiety in other ways and feeling comfortable with people in different ways. I mean, you know this, but our listeners might not. I, for many years, have taught a course for people who have received a DUI for the first time. And DUIs sweep all areas of society and all ranges of substance use. Like some people who get DUIs really have significant problems with alcohol. And some people who get DUIs, especially here in Maryland where we are, I mean, you can technically get charged for below a 0.08. Sometimes it's people who have 0.04, a 0.05 blood alcohol. They're not even regular drinkers. They had a drink at an event. And everything in between. And so we talk a lot about changes that people make across the spectrum. And one of the biggest things that people talk about is that social identity piece, and that identity, when they stop drinking, that how do I feel comfortable with who I am in social situations and even by myself without that substance. Like, what do I do with my time? What do I even like to do? Sometimes, like if the substance has consumed a lot of somebody's time, sometimes there's a sense of, this is usually what I was doing with my free time. And now I'm not even confident what my interests are. And so I'm trying to figure all of those things out and develop a comfortable social identity again, which is really tough.
Yeah, I think that really ties to one of the kind of bigger losses that I would say that people probably experience with this is, you already said it, specific to kind of the social anxiety piece and a couple of other things, but just that idea that substances in particular become a way of coping over time. And so while we may have started to use a substance socially or because it was fun or whatever, for many people, it begins to meet a need. It might meet the need that it mitigates your boredom in the evenings at the end of the day. It might meet the need that, you and your partner are using alcohol to sort of navigate your own relationship because there's stuff that's tough for you to wade through. It might be, like you said, with the social anxiety. And then specific to our audience, it might be that you have some really serious things going on in your life, like loss and trauma, that substances like numb, having to think about. And the problem is that once we start, using that, it's like kind of using a Tylenol, right? We need to have the Tylenol in our system for it to numb the pain. And when it wears off, we need more Tylenol. So it's kind of like, we need to continuously use this substance to numb that emotional pain. And sometimes we have a night where we do that, a weekend, and then we say, all right, we need to face our things. But sometimes the substance becomes a chronic way of avoiding completely. And when we do that, all we're doing is putting things off. And that's the thing. When we then take the substance out, we then have to face things without the coping tool. And so there's the loss of having that coping tool, having something to help us, having something to make us feel better in that moment, and having to find other healthier coping tools. And having definitely been there, I will tell you, the healthier coping tools are harder. The substances are a shortcut. And I find the healthy coping tools are difficult. They're difficult to make a part of your life. At times, some of you may be like, no, I totally disagree, and that's fine. This is me. I'm bad at that stuff. But it is, I personally think that substances are a shortcut, and some of the more constructive and healthy and coping tools can be a little less accessible at times.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with you there, because just on a fundamental physiological level, when we think about how a substance works, like you ingest it and almost immediately your brain starts to release feel-good chemicals. Your brain starts to release GABA, which is like our natural anti-anxiety neurotransmitter. It starts doing all of the things that we want, things like taking walks and going to the gym and doing art and listening to music. And, all of those things do that in the brain, but it takes longer. It's usually to a less significant degree,
Right.
in terms of how it lasts. There are far fewer negative side effects.
Right.
But I mean, it literally physiologically, like, it is this shortcut that when you're really suffering, it makes sense that oftentimes those are the places that we go. And I think when we talk about the idea that grief is learning, right? Like, part of grief is that we're learning how to exist in the world after a loss, or that just anything, you know, that we go through that is significantly disrupts our life. We're relearning that. Part of it is learning how to feel the pain. And when you've used a shortcut for a long time to try to distance yourself from the pain, numb the pain, get away from the pain, when you finally shift that and you're now learning to, like, be with that pain, that is incredibly hard. And so now you're learning to be with the pain while simultaneously trying to figure out, what are my new coping skills? How do I rebuild my identity? Oh, now these other relationships are being impacted and I don't feel like I have the same people I had. You know, there's so many layers to that it is so hard. And it's so much loss.
Well, and let's be honest, like, it's a coping tool that not only kind of removes the pain, but at one point felt really good. Many people have experiences with substances that they thought were really fun or felt really great, you know? And so it's kind of like you miss not only, you know, you don't want to experience the pain, so you miss the numbing, but you might also miss kind of the excitement of it and the fun of it. Like, I definitely, like, we'll be honest, I miss having a bottle of wine and knowing I have like 3 hours of Netflix I can watch. I miss that. That sounds so boring. So when I say excitement, I mean, I also miss, like, thinking I'm going to a party. I am not like a social butterfly. I was not going to, like, parties every night. But like, once in a while, like, there'd be a Christmas party and I knew it was going to be a fun time. So, like, I definitely miss those good times too, that I associate as being assisted partially by the substance, you know?
Yeah. Well, and I think part of this, you know, the idea that to grieve, part of it is acknowledging what we've lost. One of the things that's hard is, like, even what you just said, right? I felt like you, like, hesitated to want to say, I miss this.
Yeah.
When it's like, of course you miss it. You know, I think things with a substance, there's that all or nothing idea of, oh, if I decided that I should no longer be using this substance, then I must be feeling like everything about it was bad, when it's like, no, it was a mixed bag. I was getting things from it. And those are things that I feel loss around. And it's important to be able to acknowledge, like, oh no, maybe I just really miss having a bottle of wine and watching Netflix. And, like, it's okay to just, whatever that is with the substance, I think to acknowledge all the different pieces of the loss. So many people, I think, we hear from who are just like, I miss that escape. I miss being able to feel like my brain that's overactive, I could shut it down for a little while, or, you know, do some of those things. It's a big loss.
I think the last thing that I would personally mention, and for me, like, I've noticed it a little bit, but I also, in people that I know who have had, like, really sort of serious addictions, I think it's an even bigger thing, is that you oftentimes have to just kind of create a new day-to-day existence. I think sometimes it's because your previous life was so centered around getting substances and consuming substances. But also, I think there's so many things that might feel like triggers or reminders or temptations that you then have to kind of craft a new existence. And I think that can feel really, really tough for people, because it's like, well, but there's so much about before that I like, or I don't even know where to begin doing that. Like, that's really hard. Like, if I told you tomorrow you had to change like 50% of your lifestyle, 50% of your habits or your go-to day-to-day routine behaviors, like, that would be difficult to shift. And so I think that for a lot of people, there might be that middle ground where they're trying to say, like, I can still be this person. I can still live in this city, live in this house, live with these people, hang out with these people. And maybe they can make it work, but for a lot of people, they can't. And I think that's really tough, because then it's like, okay, well, then what? You know?
Yeah, no, I think it's so true. And I think that with, you know, this is maybe related, but different. someone from our Griever Hub just mentioned this of when within a relationship that getting sober can really change the dynamics of that relationship. And I think that that is another piece, like when your day-to-day life maybe involves that you live with a person and that your relationship, whether you are both using the substance or whether it was just you, when you make a change, it changes the dynamic of that relationship. And then trying to figure that out too. Like, okay, wait, I might actually have to be making real changes within my relationship and figuring out what this means as well, which is really, another extra layer of that day-to-day life and identity when you're, in a relationship with someone.
Definitely. There's just a lot that might need to change. And like we said, like change equals loss. And when you think about all the things that need to change or that will change, you can see where all this loss kind of piles up. And again, for some people, it may feel a lot easier to navigate. Maybe they feel like it was easier for them to give up whatever lifestyle change it is or whatever substance. They may feel like I really quickly shifted into a different lifestyle that I love, that I feel comfortable with, that feels good to me. And that's really good. But we just kind of want to normalize it for the people who are in the middle, kind of straddling and wondering, is all this emotion that feels really kind of distressing or troubling or difficult, is that all normal? And so we really kind of wanted to normalize that for people.
Yeah, no, I'm curious, like before we wrap up, if there's things for you that have felt helpful or that have really felt like, okay, there has been all of this loss associated with this. It was this huge change that impacted all these areas, but like this is something that has really helped that grief or helped me to be able to stay the course.
Yeah. I think for me, maybe I had, I mentioned kind of being more introverted. And in a sense, I think that's something that I have going for me in this situation, because I don't, like, though I feel loss around relationships, it doesn't bother me to be at home on a Friday night in the least bit. There are definitely times where I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I had like more to do. I'm bored. I wish I had, more adult relationships, but it doesn't bother me to not be at a party. Like, I am not that person who's like, can't sit still. I love being at home and almost too much. So for me, I think that just having that personality trait was a little helpful. Yeah. I think the other thing that has really helped me to just stay focused is, I guess for many people, what it would look like is that kind of just focusing on your purpose and your meaning and your why. Because for me, I think being able to be present with my kids in the way I want to be feels very important. I think now that they're older, had I kept drinking, I would feel a lot of inner turmoil just knowing myself about being drunk around them. And I know if I kept up with it, I think it would eat away at me. And that's just me personally. And I think that's because of the environment I was brought up in. And so for everybody, it's different. And this is absolutely no shade, like on anybody who drinks, like with older kids. Like, I don't think that's a problem. I think it's totally fine. But for me, I just think that it would have been something I was uncomfortable with. And so I think being able to focus on that. And again, like I said, many people are able to drink a reasonable amount. I identify that I am somebody who isn't able to stop once I start. So I think for me, it's kind of focusing on that. And then just like, remembering, I used to feel so crappy every morning and just like kind of appreciating that. I don't do it as much anymore, but in the beginning I did. Like every morning I woke up and I was like, am I hungover? Oh no, I'm not.
Yeah. Well, and I think, when you look at the research that's out there, like what you just described is right in line with it, is that oftentimes when people first decide to stop using a substance or get sober, it's oftentimes that they identify like the stuff they're trying to avoid, like you know, oh, I don't want to have hangovers anymore. I don't want to be spending all of my time and money and, you know, whatever around this substance. And like the initial things people often label are like, I don't want this stuff in my life anymore. But where it starts to be really helpful over the long term is, they say, when you can start to see the things that it's opening up and allowing you to have in your life, where it's like, oh, I'm able to be more present with my kids and that feels really good, or I'm able to, you know, feel good in the morning. And like, yes, I'm avoiding the hangover, but what is really driving me is what that opens up space for. Like I'm able now to be more clear and focused in my work or whatever that is. And those are the things that sometimes really, I think, do help people when they're trying to carry together. Like, yes, there's all these things that I've lost, and can I create space to make sure I'm acknowledging too, like these spaces that have opened up for me with my sobriety.
Totally. And it's so subjective. It's like just the meaning that you personally find. And so I think it's going to look different for everybody. If you are somebody who's kind of wondering, do I want to get sober? I think that decision is incredibly personal and will look different for everybody. So it's hard to sometimes talk about some of these things because they are so personal in many ways. And you just know that other people have such different experiences and may feel like, oh, I don't agree with that, or I agree with this piece or whatever. And so anytime we talk about loss in general, we just always encourage people to take the things that make sense to you and that work for you and store those away, and things that don't, throw them away, because there's really no rule book at all for any of this stuff, you know?
So. Yeah. And we'll share some resources in the show notes of just, you know, things related. We'll share the article that Eleanor wrote, but we'll share just also some resources if you're thinking of getting sober, if you're also in that sober curious place. Like there's this whole sober curious movement now that is really about expanding spaces for, if you're not an introvert like Eleanor, there are all of these spaces now that are, you know, sober pop-ups at bars or sober bars, and places that are trying to encourage being able to socially interact with other people and not give up some of those spaces, and have places where, you know, you can connect with someone else who's sober that's outside of like a support group or an AA meeting or something like that. So we'll share a bunch of resources around things like that, if that would be helpful for folks. And just as a reminder, we've opened up our membership for our Griever Hub. So if you are interested in being able to tune in live when we record the podcast, you can join there, and that have access to all of the other wonderful things that are there too. Our library of past workshops and webinar recordings and forum to connect with other people. So we'll have the link to that in the show notes as well.
Yep. And just as a reminder, we always love your topic suggestions, and you can email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com or reach out to us on social media, mostly Instagram, if we're being honest here. We are at What's Your Grief.
Thanks, everyone.